You came here to use me, Ethan said, his voice flat and hard as iron. Beautiful woman, desperate man, dying ranch. I understand exactly what this looks like. Isabella didn't flinch. She set her single suitcase on his porch, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "And you brought me here to save yourself. So we're even." The silence between them was the kind that holds an entire war inside it. He had expected submission. She had expected cruelty. Neither got what they prepared for, and neither of them had any idea that what they'd actually gotten was the one thing neither had ever been given before: each other. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Ethan Cole had not spoken to another human being in 11 days. Not because he was angry. Not because he was proud. Simply because there was no one left to speak to, and the silence had become something he wore like a second skin, heavy, familiar, and far too easy to stop noticing. He'd sent the letter 3 months ago on a Tuesday, drunk on cheap whiskey, and the particular kind of despair that only arrives at 2 in the morning when the numbers don't add up, and they haven't added up in a year and a half. He'd addressed it to a brokerage agency out of Denver that matched Western ranchers with women looking for placement, stability, a different life. He'd written 6 sentences. Given his dimensions, land size, cattle count, debt load, like he was filing a business proposal. He hadn't mentioned his dead wife. He hadn't mentioned that the house still smelled like her lavender soap because he couldn't bring himself to open the windows. He'd mailed it and gone to sleep and woken up the next morning fully expecting to forget he'd done it. He did not forget. And 3 months later, on a Wednesday that looked exactly like every other Wednesday, a wagon rolled down his dirt road carrying 1 passenger and 1 suitcase, and Ethan Cole stood on his porch with his hat in his hands and understood for the first time in a long time that something was actually about to happen. He watched her climb down from the wagon, and his first honest, unguarded thought was not wonder. It was not attraction. It was not hope. It was, she will be gone in 2 weeks. Isabella Marquez had been many things in her 31 years. A daughter. A servant. A woman who'd been handed from one set of expectations to another, like property with a name attached. She'd been beautiful since she was 15, and she'd learned quickly that beauty in a woman with no money and no family name was not a gift. It was a problem. It was something that made powerful men want to own you, and made powerless men want to resent you, and navigating the distance between those two categories had cost her more than she was willing to admit on a Wednesday afternoon in front of a stranger. She stepped off that wagon and looked at the ranch. She did not look at it the way most people look at a place they've just arrived at for the first time, with the soft, searching eyes of someone deciding whether they like it. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with the quick, practical assessment of a woman calculating exits. The fence posts were rotting on the left side. The barn needed new planks across the upper loft. The garden beside the house had been abandoned long enough that the weeds had taken complete control. The water trough near the corral was cracked along the bottom. She could see the dark stain of old leaking from 10 yards away. Then she looked at the man. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way that comes from actual work, not vanity. He had the kind of face that had once been open and was now mostly closed, with the exception of his eyes, which were brown and exhausted, and watching her with the specific wariness of someone waiting for disappointment. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself for years. "You're Ethan Cole," she said. Not a question. "I am." He didn't move from the porch. "You're Isabella Marquez." "I am." A pause. The wagon driver climbed back up onto his seat. Neither of them said goodbye to him. The wagon turned and rolled back down the road, and just like that, they were alone with each other, and the silence between them was the kind that asks a question no one's ready to answer. Ethan came down the porch steps. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Hers was the same. "I'll show you the house," he said. "I'd like to see the barn first," she said. He blinked. "The barn. The fence posts on your left perimeter are failing. Your water trough has a crack. I want to understand what's working before I understand what isn't." She looked at him. "Unless that's a problem." Ethan Cole looked at this woman, this impossibly beautiful, completely unreadable woman, and for the first time in 11 days, he felt something in his chest that was not grief and not dread. It might have been curiosity. "No," he said slowly. "That's not a problem." Oh. They didn't talk much that first afternoon. She walked the property like she was reading it. Opened gates, tested hinges, crouched beside the water trough and ran her finger along the crack, calculated something in her head, stood back up without a word. She checked the feed supply in the barn. Not enough for winter, she noted, though she didn't say it aloud. She looked at the chickens, counted them, looked at Ethan. "You've got 8 hens," she said. "You should have at least 14 for consistent laying. What happened to the others?" "Illness," he said. "About 4 months ago. I lost half the flock." "Did you quarantine in time?" He hesitated. "Not entirely." She nodded slowly, not with judgment, but with the focused consideration of someone who was already inside the problem and looking for the edges. "I can work with 8. It'll take time, but it's manageable." They went inside the house. It was dark. Not because the sun wasn't out. It was, but because all the curtains were drawn, and there was a layer of quiet over everything that felt less like peace and more like a space that had stopped expecting anyone to arrive. There were dishes stacked on the counter that weren't dirty. There was a coat hanging by the door that wasn't Ethan's, too small, too feminine. There was a photograph on the mantel that he didn't look at when they walked past it. Isabella noticed all of it and said nothing. She set her suitcase at the foot of the stairs and turned to face him. "Before we establish anything," she said, "I want to be clear about what I understand the arrangement to be, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong." "All right," Ethan said. "I'm here as your wife in the legal and practical sense. I'll work the land, manage the household, keep the books if you need it. In exchange, I have shelter, safety, and legal standing in this country." She kept her eyes on his direct and without apology. "What I'm not here for is performance. I'm not here to pretend to be something I'm not for the sake of people in town or anyone else. If that's what you need, tell me now." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "What I need," he said quietly, "is someone who won't disappear when the work gets hard." "I've never once disappeared from hard work," Isabella said. "It's the only thing I'm certain of." Something moved across Ethan's face. Not a smile. Not quite. But something adjacent to it, like the memory of one. "Then I think we'll manage," he said. The first week was difficult in ways neither of them had anticipated. Not because of conflict, because of proximity. Ethan had lived alone long enough that the presence of another human being in his house felt physically strange, like a temperature change he couldn't quite adjust to. He heard her moving in the kitchen before sunrise. He heard her voice when she talked to the horses, low and steady, and occasionally in Spanish, a language he didn't speak, but found himself listening to anyway. He heard her at night, not sleeping, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on, and some kind of ledger open in front of her, writing things down with the focused concentration of someone solving a puzzle. He left her alone. That was his instinct, to give people space, to not ask, to not intrude. It had been his instinct with his wife too, and she had sometimes appreciated it, and sometimes been wounded by it, and he had never entirely learned to tell the difference. On the 4th day, he came downstairs at 5 in the morning and found that Isabella had already reorganized the kitchen. Every cabinet was different. The tools were in a different order. The supplies were grouped and stacked in a system that made immediate obvious sense, and he stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds just looking at it. "I should have asked," Isabella said from across the room. She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "I did it at night because I couldn't sleep, and I didn't think about the fact that it's your kitchen. I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "You don't like it." "I didn't say that." "You've been standing in the doorway for half a minute." He looked at the back of her head. "I was just thinking that it makes more sense this way." She turned then and looked at him, and there was something careful in her expression, like she was deciding whether to believe him. "It does. The cast iron was in the wrong cabinet. You put it near the stove where it actually belongs." He walked to the coffee pot. "My wife always meant to move it, never got around to it." The air changed. They both felt it, the word hanging in the space between them. Wife. Not Isabella. Not a description of the past. Just the word itself, still present, still waited. "I'm sorry for your loss," Isabella said quietly. "It was 2 years ago. That doesn't change the weight of it." He poured his coffee, said nothing for a moment. Then, "No, it doesn't." She turned back to the stove. He sat down at the table, and for the first time, the silence between them was something that held them gently instead of keeping them apart. By the end of the second week, Ethan noticed something that made him uneasy. He was watching for her. Not in the way a man watches a beautiful woman, though he would have been a liar to say he hadn't noticed, but in the practical, involuntary way that the mind tracks something it has decided to depend on. When he came in from the north field, he registered whether the kitchen light was on. When he rode fence in the early morning, he noted whether the barn door had been opened, which meant she was already up, already working, already 3 steps into the day. He noticed when she didn't eat enough at dinner, and he said nothing because it wasn't his place. And then he noticed that she noticed, he'd noticed, and still neither of them said anything about it. He noticed the way she moved around the livestock without fear, without theatrical affection, just confident, practical calm. The cattle trusted her faster than they'd trusted any of the ranch hands he'd hired over the years. She didn't force it. She just waited and let them decide, and they decided. He noticed that she never asked for help, and he noticed that she never pretended not to need it. One afternoon he came around the corner of the barn and found her struggling to reset a fence post that had come loose in the rain. Not panicking, not cursing, just quietly determined. Her boots sunk 3 inches in the mud, and her jaw set, and her entire body focused on the problem in front of her. He took the post without a word. She let him. They reset it together, and the whole operation took about 4 minutes, and when it was done, she looked at him sideways and said, "I was going to get there." "I know," he said, "but thank you." "Sure." He turned to walk back to the field. "Ethan." He stopped. "Why did you really write to the agency?" she asked. Not sharp, not accusatory, just a direct question from a woman who'd learned that indirect ones only led to longer distances between people. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned around. "Because I was losing everything," he said. "The bank was 6 weeks from foreclosure. My foreman quit, and I was sitting in that house at 2 in the morning and I thought..." He stopped, looked at the ground. "I thought that maybe if someone else was living inside these walls, they'd stop feeling so empty." Isabella was quiet. "That's honest," she said finally. "I'm not much for anything else. Neither am I." She wiped her hands on her work pants. "For what it's worth, the walls don't feel as empty now." He looked at her. She was already walking toward the house. And Ethan Cole stood in the mud in the afternoon light and felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he hadn't touched in 2 years. The debt collector arrived on a Thursday. His name was Gerald Holt, and he worked for the First Federal Bank of Billings, and he had the particular energy of a man who had decided in advance that this conversation was not going to be pleasant for him or for the person he was visiting, and had made his peace with that fact. He came in a wagon. He came with documents. He came while Ethan was out in the south field, which meant that it was Isabella who opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. Whatever he'd been expecting, it was not this, and he showed it in the half-second delay before he recovered his professional composure. "I'm looking for Ethan Cole," he said. "He's working," Isabella said. "I'm his wife. Can I help you?" Holt blinked. Then he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "I wasn't told Mr. Cole had a wife." "There's a great deal people aren't told," Isabella said pleasantly. "Would you like to come inside, or would you prefer to state your business from the doorstep?" He came inside. She poured him coffee, which she hadn't offered but did anyway, because she understood immediately that she needed to understand what he knew before Ethan got back, and keeping a man comfortable made him talk. It worked. In 20 minutes, she had the full picture, the loan amount, the terms, the accumulated interest, the precise timeline Holt had been authorized to enforce. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She thanked him for the coffee. When Ethan walked through the door 20 minutes later, She was standing at the table with the papers laid out and organized, and she had a legal pad beside them with notes in her clear, angular handwriting. He looked at these papers. He looked at her. He looked at Holt. "Mr. Cole," Holt said, "I wasn't aware of your recent situation." "My wife handles our paperwork," Ethan said without missing a beat, and Isabella did not allow herself to react to the words "my wife" in any way that anyone in the room could see. "Well," Holt looked uncertain. "I have papers that require—" "I've reviewed them," Isabella said. She turned to Ethan, calm and direct. "The foreclosure timeline is 12 weeks from today. The interest accumulation is structured in a way that accelerates every 30 days. We have options, but we need to move quickly." She looked at Holt. "We'll have a formal response prepared within the week." Holt looked between them. He looked at the organized papers. He looked at Isabella, and whatever he'd assumed when he arrived had clearly been revised. "A week is acceptable," he said. When he left, Ethan stood in the middle of the kitchen and stared at the legal pad. "You got all that from him in 20 minutes, he said. He was comfortable. Comfortable men talk. She sat down across from him. "How bad is it the real number, not what you told the agency?" He told her. The real number was worse than Holt had said, because there was a second lien. Ethan hadn't mentioned to anyone, and saying it aloud for the first time felt like pulling something out of his chest that had been lodged there for a year. Isabella listened to every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She picked up her pencil and wrote things down. "All right," she said when he was finished. "This is not unfixable, but I need you to tell me everything, not just the bank, the equipment debt, the supplier accounts, all of it." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I'm not going to help you save half a ranch, Ethan. Either we do this properly, or we don't do it at all." He stared at her across the table. This woman who'd arrived less than 2 weeks ago, with one suitcase and no promises. And something inside him that had been clenched for 2 years slowly, quietly began to release. "All right," he said, and they got to work. The nights were long. They worked after dinner. The lamp stayed on past midnight. Isabella was relentless in the best possible sense, not frantic, not anxious, but precise. She found errors in Ethan's accounts that dated back 3 years. She found a supplier contract that had been overcharging him by 12% on grain. She found a cattle registration that had lapsed without anyone noticing, which was costing him tax penalties he hadn't known about. Ethan sat across from her and answered every question and watched her work, and he thought about how little he had known in those early days of the ranch about what he was doing, about how much of it he had tried to carry alone. "How do you know all of this?" he asked at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. She looked up from the ledger. "Know what?" "The accounts, the legal terms, the way you handled Holt." He leaned back in his chair. "Where did you learn that?" She was quiet for a moment. "I worked for a man in Texas," she said slowly. "For 3 years. He was wealthy, successful. He kept very detailed accounts." She paused. "And he never expected the woman who cleaned his office to be paying attention to them." The sentence landed quietly. Ethan heard what she wasn't saying. "Isabella." "I'm fine," she said. Not defensively, just clearly. "It's past, and I learned a great deal." She looked back at the ledger. "Which is useful now." He didn't push. He respected the boundary. But later that night, lying awake in the dark, he thought about what that sentence had cost her. Not the words, but the life behind them. The years of being underestimated. The years of being reduced to what she looked like instead of what she understood. He thought about his wife who had worked beside him for 6 years and never once been given enough credit for what she made possible. He thought about how little most men actually saw. And for the first time since Isabella had arrived, he felt something that was not gratitude, and not curiosity, and not the comfortable familiarity of shared work. He felt the beginning of something much more dangerous. He closed his eyes. He told himself it would pass. He was wrong. It was during the 3rd week that the town got involved. Millhaven was small enough that everyone's business was everyone's business, and Ethan Cole's sudden marriage to a strikingly beautiful stranger had not gone unnoticed. It had in fact been the subject of considerable conversation at the general store at the church steps on Sunday, and in the back room of Patterson's saloon on 4 separate occasions. Most people were simply curious. A few were warm. Mrs. Hendricks at the dry goods counter asked Isabella kind questions and sent her home with a jar of preserves. The minister's wife stopped by on a Tuesday and left a pie. But not everyone was warm. A man named Douglas Farrow owned the land adjacent to Ethan's ranch on the eastern border. He was wealthy, and he knew it, and he wanted more land, and he had been waiting patiently, strategically for the coal ranch to fail. He had expected it to happen by spring. He had counted on it, in fact. He had already, in quiet conversations with certain bank officials, expressed interest in purchasing the property at foreclosure. He had not counted on Isabella. He came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon. Didn't send word ahead. Just rode up to the house and dismounted and knocked on the door with the casual authority of a man who had never been told no and didn't expect to start today. Isabella opened the door. He looked at her, and his expression cycled through 3 or 4 things before settling on something that was trying to be cordial. "I'm looking for Ethan," he said. "He's in the East Field," she said. "I'm his wife. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Farrow? Douglas Farrow." He said it like it explained everything. "I'm a neighbor. I have business with Ethan." "I'm certain you do," she said. "He'll be back in about an hour. You're welcome to wait on the porch." She did not invite him inside. He noticed. His expression tightened slightly. "I'd prefer to speak with him directly." "I imagine you would," she said pleasantly. "The chairs on the porch are quite comfortable." She closed the door. She went back to the kitchen, and she didn't look out the window. And when Ethan came back and found Farrow waiting for him, she stayed inside and listened through the screen door and heard every word of the conversation. And by the time it was over, she understood exactly who Douglas Farrow was and exactly what he wanted. When Ethan came inside, his jaw was tight. "What did he say?" she asked. "Offered to buy the ranch. He hung up his hat. Framed it as doing me a favor." "He's been expecting you to fail," she said. "The offer is already prepared. He had the numbers ready." Ethan looked at her. "You heard all that." "I heard enough." She turned back to the stove. "He'll come back, and the next time he'll be less polite." "I know. Which means we need to be ready before he does." Ethan sat down at the table. He looked at her back, the straight, calm line of her spine, the certainty in her movements, and he felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with Farrow. "Isabella," he said. She turned. "Thank you," he said. "For—" He stopped. Looked for the right word. Couldn't find one large enough. "For not running." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face did something complicated, something that started as distance and then shifted just slightly into something warmer and less certain. "I told you," she said quietly. "I don't run from hard work." She turned back to the stove. And Ethan Cole sat in his kitchen in the long afternoon light and understood with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 2 years trying not to feel anything that he was already in serious trouble. The trouble with Douglas Farrow was not that he was dangerous. The trouble was that he was patient. Ethan had known men like Farrow his entire life, men who could afford to wait because waiting cost them nothing. They didn't need the thing they wanted. They simply wanted it, and so they bided their time, and they watched, and they let circumstances do the work of wearing a person down, until the moment came when the offer looked like relief instead of surrender. Ethan had watched it happen to 3 neighboring ranches in the past 4 years. The Walkers, 3 miles south. The Prentice family on the Creek Road. Old man Gerber, who'd built his land up from nothing over 40 years and lost it in 6 months when the drought took 2 consecutive harvests, and Farrow showed up at his door with a check already written. He had sworn it would not happen to him. He had sworn that standing over his wife's grave with the ranch already starting to slip and no good answers anywhere he looked. He had made that promise to a dead woman and to himself. And it was the only thing that had kept him from walking away in those first terrible months after she was gone. But promises were easy in the abstract. They were harder when Gerald Holt was sitting at your kitchen table with foreclosure papers, and the math was what it was, and the walls were so empty they made sounds at night. Isabella was the thing that had changed the math. Not in any way he'd expected. Not in any way he'd have known to ask for. She had been in his house for 23 days, and in those 23 days, she had reorganized his accounts, renegotiated 2 supplier contracts through written correspondence that she'd drafted herself in precise formal language that somehow never sounded cold, convinced his most unreliable field hand to start showing up on time by having one direct conversation with him that Ethan had not been present for, and that the field hand, Tommy Briggs, had refused to describe in any detail afterward, except to say, "Your wife don't waste words." She had fixed 3 fence sections. She had increased egg production by rearranging the chicken rotations. She had identified a slow water leak in the South Trough system that had been costing him more than he'd realized for at least a year. And she had done all of it quietly, without announcement, without asking for acknowledgement, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had learned that the only reliable thing in the world was her own 2 hands. Ethan was trying very hard not to think about her too much. He was failing at it completely. It happened in ordinary moments, which was the worst part. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind of moments that would make sense as a starting point for something. No, it was smaller than that. It was the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she was thinking through a problem. It was the way she said his name, Ethan, without any particular warmth or coldness. Just his name, direct and clear, like she'd decided it was worth saying properly. It was the way she laughed exactly once in those 23 days at something Tommy Briggs said in the yard, and the laugh was startled and genuine and gone again in half a second, like she'd let it out before she could stop it. He told himself he was grateful. That was all this was. Gratitude. He didn't quite believe himself, but he held on to it anyway. Then the letter arrived, and everything got harder. It came on a Monday, addressed to Isabella, in an envelope with no return address. She was outside when the postwriter came, and Ethan took it in without thinking, and when she came through the door, he held it out to her and said, "Letter for you." She stopped moving, not dramatically, not visibly to most people. But Ethan was watching. He'd learned to watch her in those 23 days the way you learn to read weather, and he saw it. The stillness that came over her when she registered the handwriting on the envelope. The way her hand came forward slowly, like the paper itself might be something she needed to approach with caution. She took it. She didn't open it. She put it in her coat pocket and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was entirely composed, and then she went upstairs. She didn't come down for 2 hours. When she did, the letter was not with her, and she went straight to the kitchen and started on dinner, and didn't mention it. And Ethan knew in the way that he was increasingly coming to know things about her, that she never directly said that she was not going to mention it. He thought about the sentence she'd said that night over the ledgers. The man in Texas. The careful way she'd closed it off. The life behind the words she'd chosen not to speak. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down, picked it up again. "Isabella," he said. Are you all right?" "Yes." That was very fast. She turned to look at him. There was something behind her eyes. Not fear exactly. Something more controlled than fear. Something that had already processed the fear and come out the other side of it and was now managing the remainder with the discipline of long practice. "It was from someone I used to know," she said. "It's handled." "The someone from Texas." A pause. "Yes." "Isabella, if there's something—" "Ethan." Her voice was quiet and firm and not unkind. "I will tell you when there's something you need to know. Right now there isn't." She turned back to the stove. "Dinner will be ready in half an hour." He left it alone. But that night, he lay awake longer than usual, and what he thought about was not the ranch finances or Douglas Faro or the foreclosure timeline. What he thought about was the look on her face when she'd seen that handwriting. The way her hand had moved toward the envelope like it was something to be survived. He thought about what kind of person sent a letter with no return address. He didn't sleep well. The following Sunday, they went to town. It was the first time they'd gone together as a unit in the 3 weeks she'd been there. Ethan had been avoiding it without entirely admitting he was avoiding it because he knew what Millhaven was like, and he knew what people would say, and he wasn't certain he was prepared to stand beside this woman in public and manage whatever came of it. He needn't have worried about being prepared. Isabella handled it better than he did. She wore a simple dress, dark blue practical, and she walked beside him into the general store with the same calm she carried everywhere. And she greeted Mrs. Hendricks by name and asked after her husband's knee, which she'd apparently heard about from someone. And Mrs. Hendricks lit up and talked for 10 minutes straight, and by the time they left the store, 3 more people had been introduced, and 2 of them had shaken Isabella's hand, and 1 had invited them both to Sunday supper. Ethan watched her do it, and felt something between amazement and humility. "You're good at that," he said, as they walked toward the feed merchant. "At what?" "Talking to people. Making them comfortable." She was quiet for a moment. "I've spent a great deal of my life needing people to decide I wasn't a threat," she said. "You learn." The sentence sat between them plain and terrible in its practicality. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. She looked at him sideways. "No," she agreed. "But I did. So." They walked in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You're not bad at it either, you know, when you actually try." "I don't usually try." "I've noticed." "A beat." "Try harder." He almost smiled. She kept walking. They were at the feed merchant when Douglas Farrow walked in. He saw them immediately, saw Isabella first. The way everyone always did, that involuntary half-second of recalibration. And then he composed himself and came toward them with the particular stride of a man who had decided to be magnanimous. "Ethan," he said, "and Mrs. Cole." He said Mrs. Cole the way you'd say a phrase in a foreign language you didn't quite believe in. "Farrow," Ethan said. "Lovely to see you in town." He was looking at Isabella. "Settling in well, I hope." "Very well, thank you," Isabella said. "It can be quite an adjustment, coming from—" He paused with that particular pause that asks a question without technically asking it. "Wherever it is you came from." "I've adjusted quickly," she said, pleasantly, completely unrevealing. Farrow smiled. He was about 50, silver-haired, dressed better than anyone else in the room, and he had the practiced ease of a man who won most conversations without raising his voice. "I was just saying to some of the fellows at Patterson's," he said, still directed at Ethan, but watching Isabella, "that it must be quite a relief, having company out at that place, after so long." "It is," Ethan said. "Of course the place still has its challenges." He said it gently, almost sympathetically. "I was speaking with Gerald Holt last week, actually. He mentioned the situation is—" He chose his word carefully, complicated. Isabella turned to look at a shelf of supply catalogs. Ethan kept his face still. "Our situation is our business, Douglas. Of course, of course." Farrow raised both hands in a gesture of gentle surrender. "I only mention it because if you ever decide the burden is more than well, my offer stands. It's a generous one." "I know what it is," Ethan said. "The land alone is worth—" "I said I know what it is." Farrow looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled again, and the smile was patient in a way that said, "I can wait as long as it takes." "Well, you know where to find me." He nodded to Isabella. "Mrs. Cole, lovely meeting you properly." "Likewise," Isabella said without turning from the shelf. Farrow left. The feed merchant behind the counter was very focused on his inventory. Ethan turned to Isabella. "You all right?" "He's spoken to the bank," she said quietly, still looking at the catalogs. "He already knows the specific terms of your loan," Holt told him. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You got that from 30 seconds of conversation." "He said the situation is complicated. That's a specific phrase. Holt used it to me, word for word." She turned now, and her eyes were sharp and clear and very focused. "They have an arrangement, which means the timeline might be shorter than what we were told." Ethan stared at her. "How short?" "I don't know, but we need to find out." She picked up a catalog and put it back. "Let's finish here and go home. I have a letter to write." They finished quickly. They went home. Isabella sat down at the table and wrote a very careful, very specific letter to a land attorney in Billings, whose name she had found in a 3-month-old newspaper, and she wrote it without asking Ethan whether he agreed, and then she looked at him and said, "Do you trust me?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She nodded and sealed the envelope. The letter came back in 10 days. What it contained changed everything. The attorney, a man named Charles Whitmore, had confirmed what Isabella suspected. The loan term Ethan had signed contained a buried acceleration clause that allowed the bank to demand full repayment if they determined the property's operational viability was in question. It was vague language written to be triggered at the bank's discretion. And Gerald Holt, it turned out, had submitted a report to the bank board 2 weeks before his visit to the ranch, a report that described the coal property as non-viable without significant external investment. He had filed the report before he'd even knocked on Ethan's door. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he put it flat on the table and looked at the wall for a long moment. "He was never coming to give me a warning," he said. "He was coming to start the clock." "Yes," Isabella said. "And Pharaoh requested the report. According to Whitmore, there's a pattern. 3 other ranches in the county. Same structure, same bank officer, same buyer at foreclosure." She paused. "It's not a coincidence, Ethan. It's a system." He looked at her. "Whitmore put this in a letter. He put it carefully in a letter. Nothing he can't support." She turned the page over. "He says he'll take the case. He thinks the acceleration clause is legally challengeable. The language is too broad. He's seen it overturned before." "What does he want to do it?" She told him the number. It was not small. Ethan was quiet. "We don't have that," he said. "Not immediately." She leaned forward. "But we have time if we can stall the bank. Whitmore says a formal legal challenge freezes the foreclosure timeline while it's in review." She tapped the letter. "That buys us months. And in those months, we make the ranch viable, provably. Documented income, increasing cattle numbers, cleared supplier accounts." She looked at him directly. "I've been working on a number. I think with the right moves in the next 60 days we can demonstrate enough operational improvement to challenge Holt's report on its own terms." Ethan looked at the letter. He looked at her. He thought about Pharaoh's patient smile. He thought about his wife's coat still hanging by the door because he still hadn't been able to move it. He thought about promises made over graves. "Tell me what you need," he said. And that was when the real work began. The next 30 days were the hardest of the previous 2 years. Not because of the labor was real and constant and unrelenting. It was hard in the way that fighting for something is always harder than simply enduring the loss of it, because fighting required believing the outcome was possible, and belief was a kind of exposure that Ethan had not allowed himself in a long time. Isabella drove it, not aggressively, not by force, but with a focus and a consistency that set the rhythm for everyone around her. Tommy Briggs, who had been late or absent for the better part of 6 months, started arriving before Ethan did. A neighboring ranch hand named Carl Pruitt, who'd been between jobs, came by looking for work, and Isabella hired him on a handshake and a clear set of expectations that Carl later told Ethan were the most sensible terms anyone's ever offered. She worked the books every night. She wrote letters. She kept records of every improvement with dates and numbers and documentation that would hold up in front of a judge or a board. And during the days, she worked the land. She was not fragile. Ethan had already known that. But he kept being reminded of it in moments that caught him off guard. Coming around the barn one morning to find her and Carl repositioning the cattle fence in the rain, moving quickly and efficiently, and soaked through, and she looked up when she heard him and said, "We needed to get it done before the ground softened more," in a tone that made it clear this was a simple fact and not a report. He worked beside her. That was the part he hadn't expected. Not that she would work hard, but that working alongside her would feel the way it did. Easy. Matched. Like 2 people who had accidentally stumbled into the same rhythm without ever negotiating it. They talked during the work. Not about feelings. Not about the past. About the ranch, about problems, about what needed to happen next. But the talking was constant, and it was real, and slowly it began to contain other things. Small revelations tucked inside practical sentences. Personal histories offered between hammer swings and fence posts, the actual texture of 2 people beginning to know each other in the only way that mattered. She told him one afternoon that she'd grown up in New Mexico, that her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had been largely absent, and she had been raised in a series of households where she was tolerated but not wanted, which had taught her very young that the only security was the kind she built herself. She said it plainly. No self-pity, no invitation for it. He told her in exchange, surprising himself about his wife, about how they'd built the ranch together in the early years when it was still exciting and nothing had gone wrong yet, about how her death had not just been a grief, but a structural collapse because she had been part of how everything worked, and he hadn't understood how much until she was gone. I kept expecting to get better at the absence, he said. I never did. Isabella was quiet for a moment. You don't get better at it, she said. You get better at moving inside it. He looked at her. That's the difference, she said. You don't replace the missing thing. You learn to carry it differently. He thought about that for the rest of the day. It was Tommy Briggs who said it first. 43 days in. Tuesday evening. Ethan was settling the horses, and Tommy was doing the last check on the water lines, and the sun was going down over the ridge in long red bars that Tommy watched with the serene, uncomplicated appreciation of a man who didn't overthink things. You know, Tommy said in the casual way he said everything, I wasn't sure about any of this at first. Any of what? Ethan said. Tommy gestured vaguely toward the house. Her. The whole arrangement. He shrugged. People talked. I know people talked. I just want to say I think they were wrong. Tommy scratched the back of his neck. I don't know the right word. She's real, I guess. Whatever she is, she's real. Ethan looked at the house. The kitchen light was on. He could see Isabella's shadow moving past the window. Yeah, he said. She is. Tommy nodded, like something had been confirmed, and went back to the water lines. Ethan stood there another moment. Then he went inside. She was at the table with the ledger, and she looked up when he came in, and he crossed the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the counter and said without planning to say it, I want you to stay. She stopped writing. The silence in the room changed temperature. Ethan, I know what the arrangement was, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to change what it is. He turned to look at her. I'm saying that this ranch is coming back because of you, and I don't know what comes next, or what you want, or what you're running from. But I want you to know that you don't have to run from here. Isabella sat with that for a long moment. Her face was careful, measured. But there was something underneath the measurement, something that had been pressed down for a very long time, and was now pushing back quietly against the weight of its own containment. The man who sent that letter, she said. I haven't told you about him. You don't have to. No. She set down her pencil. I think I do. And she told him, not everything, not all at once, but enough the shape of it, the years of it, the reason she had ended up in a Denver brokerage file with nothing but a first name and a willingness to go west. The man in Texas had not simply employed her. He had believed she belonged to him. And when she'd left, she had left without permission, and he was not a man who accepted things being taken from him. The letter had been a reminder. Not a threat exactly. Just a reminder that he knew where she was. Ethan stood very still through all of it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. The letter, he said. The no-return address. Yes. He knows you're here. He knows I'm in Montana. I don't know how specifically. She looked at the table. I should have told you before. You had a right to know what you were taking on. Isabella. He waited until she looked at him. I'm glad you're here, whatever comes with that. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said things that were true. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face did the thing. It had done that first week started at distance and moved quietly and reluctantly toward something warmer. You might regret saying that, she said. I might, he agreed. I don't think I will. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she picked up her pencil, and she went back to the ledger, and she didn't leave. And that for now was enough. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, or not only because of fear. It was something more complicated than that, the kind of wakefulness that comes when you've finally said the thing you've been carrying for months, and the weight of it has shifted, and the body doesn't quite know what to do with the new configuration. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the roof, the low sound of wind through the eaves, the distant stir of cattle in the pen, and she thought about Ethan's face when she'd told him. The way he'd gone completely still. Not with shock, not with the particular male discomfort she'd seen before, when she'd given men information they didn't want, but with the focused, absorbing stillness of someone who was listening with his whole body. "I'm glad you're here. Whatever comes with that." She turned the sentence over in her mind, the way you turn something fragile, carefully trying to understand its weight without breaking it. She had not been told that in a long time. That her presence was something someone was glad of. Not her usefulness, not her appearance, not the function she served. Her actual presence complicated history, and all arriving with its full weight and being received without flinching. She didn't know what to do with that. She got up at 4:30 and went downstairs and started the coffee. And when Ethan came down at 5 and found her already at the table with the ledger open, he said nothing about it, just poured 2 cups and set one beside her, and sat down across from her, and they worked through the morning accounts together in the quiet dark before sunrise, and it was somehow the most normal thing that had happened in weeks. Charles Whitmore's formal legal challenge arrived at the bank 12 days later. Isabella had drafted the supporting documentation herself. 62 pages of operational records, income projections, supplier account histories, and land assessments, and Whitmore had submitted it with a cover letter that was precise and pointed, and made the acceleration clause's enforceability look exactly as shaky as he believed it was. Gerald Holt called the ranch 3 days after that, Ethan answered. Isabella stood 3 feet away and listened to one side of the conversation, and she could read it from his face. The shift from controlled neutrality to something harder, and then harder still, and then the quiet that meant he was deciding something. "I understand," Ethan said finally. "We'll be in touch through Mr. Whitmore." He hung up. He turned to Isabella. "The board is convening. Holt says they'll make a decision on the challenge within 30 days. "That's fast," she said. "They're nervous." He said. Ethan paused, jaw tight. "He said that if we withdraw the challenge now, they'll extend the loan by 90 days. No interest acceleration." Isabella felt the temperature of the room change. "That's a settlement offer," she said. "Yes." "Through a phone call, not through Whitmore." "Yes." She thought for a moment. "They're not supposed to contact you directly while you have legal representation. Whitmore specifically." "I know. That's a violation of the agreement." "I know, Isabella." They looked at each other. "They're scared of what Whitmore found," she said. "That's what I think too. If we withdraw, we lose the leverage. 90 days buys them time to restructure the approach. They'll come back harder." Ethan nodded slowly. "And if we don't withdraw? Then we see it through. 30 days. And we have to be ready for whatever they push back with." He leaned against the counter. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet because she understood that this was his land, his fight, his grief on the line, not hers, or not in the same way, and the decision had to come from him. "We don't withdraw," he said. She had already known that, but hearing him say it settled something in her chest. "Then I need to call Whitmore," she said. "And you need to document that phone call time, content, everything, today." I was already reaching for the paper. The town found out about the legal challenge within a week. Millhaven was small enough that bank business was not quite private business, and Gerald Holt had apparently felt that sharing certain details with certain people was professionally appropriate, or perhaps simply personally satisfying. By the following Sunday, there were people at the church steps talking about it, and by Monday it had reached Patterson's saloon, and by Tuesday it had done the full circuit and come back around to Mrs. Hendricks at the dry goods counter, who told Isabella with a kind of worried affection that people were saying Ethan Cole had gone and hired himself a lawyer trouble. Isabella thanked her and bought her flour and walked out. She was 3 steps down the street when Douglas Farrow fell into step beside her. "Mrs. Cole," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Farrow. I heard about the legal filing. Quite a bold move." "Ethan makes his own decisions," she said, keeping her pace. "Of course he does." A pause. I only wonder, and this is genuine concern, not anything else, whether the ranch can sustain a legal fight. The costs alone. We're managing. Are you? He slowed slightly, which forced her to slow or create an obvious scene. She slowed. I've seen this before, Mrs. Cole. A man holds on past the point where holding on is wise. The pride of it. The inability to accept reality. He looked at her directly. You seem like a practical woman. Surely you can see that the most practical outcome here, the most practical outcome, Isabella said clearly, is that an illegal acceleration clause gets struck down, and your arrangement with Gerald Holt gets examined a great deal more closely than either of you would prefer. She smiled at him. It was not a warm smile. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Farrow. She walked away. Her heart was hammering. She did not let it show for one single step. Ethan heard the account of it from Carl Pruitt, who had been across the street and witnessed the whole exchange, and who came back to the ranch that evening with the specific energy of a man who had just seen something that impressed him deeply and needed to say so. She just said it, Carl told him with some wonder. Right there in the middle of the street. Didn't raise her voice, didn't hesitate. He shook his head. Farrow looked like someone had handed him a live coal. Ethan found Isabella in the barn, checking the feed inventory. You confronted Farrow, he said. He approached me, she said without looking up from the inventory sheet. Carl said you mentioned his arrangement with Holt. I implied it. Isabella. He waited until she turned. If he feels cornered. He already feels cornered, she said. The filing did that. I just confirmed that we know what we know. She held his gaze. He was trying to scare me into coming home and convincing you to settle. I wanted him to understand that's not how this works. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of him, he said. Something moved across her face, complicated, honest. I'm afraid of a great many things, she said quietly. Douglas Farrow is not one of them. He nodded slowly. Be careful anyway, he said. She almost smiled. I'm always careful. The twist came on a Wednesday evening, 41 days after Isabella had arrived at the ranch, and it arrived in the form of a man Ethan did not recognize riding in from the North Road at dusk on a horse that was well kept and expensive in a way that didn't match the dusty practical world of Millhaven. Ethan was outside. He watched the rider come. The man dismounted at the gate. He was perhaps 45, dark-featured, dressed in the clothes of someone from somewhere else entirely. He looked at the house. He looked at Ethan. He smiled the kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes. I'm looking for a woman, he said. Goes by Isabella. Everything in Ethan's body went very still. No one here by that name, he said. The man tilted his head slightly. He looked at the house again, at the kitchen window, where the lamp was on, where Isabella's shadow was just barely visible. He looked back at Ethan. I think there is, he said. Ethan stepped forward. Not aggressively, but enough. He put himself between the man and the house solidly, without theater, in the way of someone who has decided where they stand, and is simply standing there. You've made a long ride for nothing, Ethan said. I suggest you head back while there's still light. The man looked at him. There was something cold and evaluating in his expression, the look of someone calculating distances and angles. Then he smiled again, that same eyes-not-involved smile. Tell her Diego says hello, he said. He remounted. He rode back down the North Road. Ethan stood absolutely still until the sound of hooves was gone entirely. Then he went inside. Isabella was at the stove. She turned when he came in, and she read his face in exactly 1 second, and the color left her own face with a speed that told him everything he needed to know about how much she'd been hoping this wouldn't happen. There was a man, Ethan said. I know. Her voice was very quiet. I saw from the window. He said to tell you Diego says hello. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were flat on the counter, and she was pressing them down, and he realized she was steadying herself, using the solid surface as a kind of anchor. Isabella. His name is Diego Vargas, she said. He's not just someone I used to know. She turned. Her face was controlled, but there was something underneath it that was working very hard to stay contained. He is a man who does not accept that I left. And he has money and connections, and he has found me, and I—" She stopped. "You're not leaving," Ethan said. She blinked. "Whatever you're about to say, that you should go, that you don't want to bring this to my door, that it's not my problem." He crossed to the table. He sat down. He looked at her directly. "You're not leaving." She stared at him. "Ethan, this man is not like Pharaoh. He is not a business problem. He is genuinely dangerous. He has people who work for him who are—" "I've been dealing with dangerous people for 2 years," Ethan said. "Just in suits. This is different." "Tell me how." She sat down. She pressed her palms together on the table. She told him fully this time all the things she hadn't said before. Diego Vargas, who had employed her father, and then when her father died in his debt, had considered Isabella the natural settlement, who had provided for her in ways that were meant to make escape feel impossible, who had tracked down 2 women who'd left his household before her and had found quiet, effective ways to make their lives very difficult, who had never threatened her overtly, never needed to. The threat was always implied, always structural, always built into the fabric of the situation. She told him how she had left. Carefully. Over months of quiet preparation. The money saved in increments, small enough not to be noticed. The contact at the agency in Denver. The letter sent from a city she'd passed through only once quickly, so it couldn't be traced back to a specific location. "I thought I'd gotten far enough," she said. "Montana seemed—" She exhaled. "Far enough." Ethan was quiet through all of it. His face didn't change in ways that were easy to read, but she'd learned in 41 days to look at the small things, the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the table, and what she saw was not alarm, and not pity, and not the specific retreating energy of a man deciding this was too complicated. What she saw was someone who had already made up his mind and was just waiting for her to finish so they could start solving the problem. "Whitmore," he said when she was done. "What? Charles Whitmore. Can he help with this? Is there a legal angle?" She blinked again. "Ethan. Harassment. Stalking. Whatever the right term is. Is there documentation we can build?" Yes, potentially, but that's not the most immediate." "What's the most immediate?" She looked at him. "He's going to come back. Not alone next time. Then we need to be ready before he does. We can't—" She stopped. Started again. "I have been running from this man for a year. I don't know how to stand and fight something like him." "You stood in the middle of a Millhaven street today," Ethan said, "and told Douglas Farrow to his face that you knew what he was. That's how." She looked at him across the table. Something cracked just slightly in the composure she'd been holding together for 41 days, and what showed through the crack was not weakness. It was something rawer and more honest than composure. It was exhaustion. It was the particular fatigue of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had never had anywhere to put it down. "I don't know what I walked into when I came here," she said. "I thought it was an arrangement, a safe place to disappear into. And—" She looked at the table. "And it became something else." She looked back at him. "You became something else. And now I'm sitting here terrified that I've put everything you've been fighting for in danger." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The ranch is a piece of land," he said finally, "with problems and debt and a foreclosure challenge that might or might not work out. But it's still just land." He held her gaze. "You are not just anything." The kitchen was completely silent. Isabella pressed her fingers against her lips briefly, a small, involuntary gesture, like catching something before it came out, and then she straightened her spine and breathed and steadied herself with the discipline of long practice. "We need a plan," she said. Her voice was almost entirely level. "Yes," Ethan said. "Starting tonight." "Starting tonight," he agreed. He reached across the table and moved the ledger to the side. He put a blank piece of paper in its place. He handed her the pencil, and for the second time since she'd arrived, they bent their heads together over a blank page and started from the beginning. The plan had 3 parts. The first was documentation building a record of Vargas's contact with the intention of establishing a pattern of harassment. Isabella wrote down everything she could remember, dated as precisely as possible, and Whitmore's office was contacted the next morning with a brief letter outlining the situation and asking whether a protective legal filing was possible in advance of direct threat. Whitmore's reply arrived in 4 days. It was cautious and specific, and contained one sentence that Isabella read 3 times. If Mr. Vargas can be connected to any illegal activity in this state, his ability to operate freely becomes significantly limited. She put the letter on the table. She looked at it. "He's not clean," she said. "He never has been. The money, the way he operates, it's not legitimate. I knew that when I was with him. I just didn't have access to anything that could prove it." "But someone does," Ethan said. "Possibly, if you know where to look." She tapped the letter. "Whitmore is saying the same thing without saying it." "Then we look." She looked at him. "This is not a simple thing, Ethan. Going after a man like Vargas. I know. If it goes wrong, I know." His voice was patient and very firm. "I understand what I'm asking. I'm asking it anyway." She was quiet for a long moment. Then quietly, "You have no idea how much I want to believe this works." "Then believe it," he said. "And let's get to work." It was Tommy Briggs who gave them the break they needed, entirely by accident. Tommy had a cousin in Laramie, a man named Joel, who worked the railway freight yards and had the kind of wide casual network that comes from spending years around moving goods and moving people and not asking too many questions about either. And Tommy, who had mentioned the situation to no one except Carl, and had understood from Carl's reaction that he should continue not mentioning it to anyone, nonetheless happened to write to Joel that week, asking after something entirely unrelated. Joel's response arrived 10 days later and contained, tucked inside 2 pages of family news, a sentence that made Tommy's blood go cold. He brought the letter to Ethan without reading him the other parts. "My cousin says there's a man been asking around the freight yards in Laramie," Tommy said. "Dark-featured, well-dressed, asking about northbound routes, specifically asking whether anyone had moved a woman. He said a particular woman on any of the northern lines in the past year." He handed the letter over. "Joel said the man offered money, good money, and that 2 of the yardmen took it." Ethan read the letter. He was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he went and got Isabella. She read the letter at the kitchen table, twice. She put it down. "He's been tracing the route," she said. "He didn't guess Montana. He worked backward from where I started and followed the line north." "Which means he knows more than just that you're here," Ethan said. "He's been building the picture." "Yes." "And he came to the ranch to confirm it." "Yes." She looked at the letter again. Her face was very still. Then she looked up, and there was something different in her eyes. Not more fear, which is what Ethan had expected. Less. Like the confirmation of the thing had somehow cleared a space that uncertainty had been occupying. "He paid men in the freight yard," she said. "Yes. That's something Whitmore can use, if those men will say so." Ethan looked at her. "You want to go after the payment?" "I want a record of him doing something provably illegal in a provable location," she said. "If we can establish that he's been conducting a search operation, essentially moving money across state lines to locate a woman who left of her own will." She stopped. "That's not just harassment. That's something more." "Joel would talk to Whitmore." "Would he?" she asked Tommy. Tommy scratched the back of his neck. "Joel's an honest man. He didn't like it when those guys took the money. He said so in the letter." He paused. "If someone official asked him, we need Whitmore on a train to Laramie," Isabella said. She looked at Ethan. He nodded once. "I'll write the letter tonight," she said. The gathering at the Hendricks' farm happened 3 days later. It was Mrs. Hendricks' idea, a Sunday supper, neighbors, invited, nothing formal. And Ethan and Isabella went, because Mrs. Hendricks had been genuinely kind, and because refusing would have required an explanation they didn't want to give. There were 14 people there. Most of them Ethan knew. Some of them he liked. One of them was Douglas Farrow, which Ethan registered the moment he walked through the door, but kept off his face entirely. The evening was warm in the way of these things. Food passed around, stories told the particular ease that comes from shared land and shared seasons. Isabella sat beside Mrs. Hendricks and talked with a quiet engagement that Ethan watched from across the room with the specific attention he'd been trying and failing to stop giving her. She was good in rooms like this. Not performatively good. Not the dazzling social ease of someone who'd practiced charm as a survival mechanism. Just genuinely present, listening more than she spoke, asking questions that were actually interested rather than polite. Mrs. Hendricks clearly adored her. Two of the other wives had moved in closer as the evening went on. Ethan was talking to a man named Fletcher about hay supply when he heard the shift in the room. I didn't hear the words first. He heard the change in energy, the way 20 people in a room simultaneously redirect their attention without quite looking like they're doing it. He turned. Douglas Farrow was standing beside Isabella. I was talking to her in the quiet, close way of a man who had calculated that a social gathering was a safe place to say things that weren't safe to say in the street. His posture was cordial. His voice was low. Isabella was looking at him with an expression Ethan had never seen on her face before, not the sharp, focused composure she'd shown him in the street. Something more careful than that. Something that was working harder. Ethan crossed the room. He heard the last two sentences as he arrived. Seems to me, Farrow was saying with the gentle magnanimity of a man delivering a kindness, that a woman in your position, new to the territory, complicated history, would want to avoid additional legal entanglements. For your own sake. Not everyone in Millhaven is as understanding as the Coles. He smiled. I only say it as a friend. Isabella opened her mouth. Ethan got there first. Douglas, he said, calm, quiet. The room was listening. My wife and I appreciate the hospitality tonight, but I don't think we need your advice on our legal affairs, or on her history. Farrow turned to him. The cordial expression held, but something underneath it adjusted. Of course. I meant no offense, Ethan. I heard what you were simply, Ethan said. The answer is no, to whatever version of the question you're building up to. The room was very quiet. Farrow held his smile for exactly 3 more seconds. Then he nodded once, pleasant, absolutely furious, underneath it, and he moved away. Ethan turned to Isabella. She was looking at him with an expression he'd never quite seen before on her face. Not gratitude, that wasn't what it was. Something more surprise than gratitude. Something that looked almost like wonder. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know. I was managing it. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment longer. Thank you, she said, quietly. Just the 2 words. Sure, he said. But as he turned back to the room, she caught his hand just briefly, the barest contact fingers against his wrist for 1 second before she released it, and it was the smallest possible gesture, and it hit him somewhere between his sternum and his spine, with the force of something much larger than it had any right to be. He stood beside her for the rest of the evening, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel alone in a room full of people. The ride home was quiet in the comfortable way their silences had become. It was Carl who had driven them, and he sat up front with the good sense to find something absorbing to look at. Along the road, and Ethan and Isabella sat side by side in the back, with 6 inches between them, that was not quite as wide as it had been 41 days ago. He's going to retaliate, Isabella said. Not alarmed, just stating. Farrow, yes. The bank challenge comes back in less than 3 weeks. I know. He'll push whatever leverage he has. He'll try. She was quiet for a moment. And Vargas could come back any day. Yes. We're fighting on 2 fronts. Appears that way. She turned to look at him in the dark. You're not afraid. He thought about it honestly. I'm afraid of the things I can't control, he said. But I stopped being afraid of the fight when you showed me it was winnable. He looked at her. You did that. She turned back to the road. The wagon moved through the dark. The stars over Montana were enormous and very close, and the air was cold and clear, and beside him, Isabella was warm and real and present, and somewhere ahead of them, 2 separate wars were waiting to be fought. But not tonight. Tonight, they were just 2 people riding home through the dark side by side with the distance between them quietly closing in. The way that true things close without announcement, without ceremony, and without anyone being entirely able to say exactly when it had happened. Whitmore's telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it contained 6 words that changed everything. Laramie confirmed. Come to Billings. Bring her. Ethan read it twice and handed it to Isabella without a word. She read it once. She set it on the table. She stood very still for a moment, and he watched her process it, the way she processed everything. Not with visible panic, not with relief, but with the careful interior calculation of someone mapping consequences before she allowed herself to feel them. He found something, she said. That's what it sounds like. Or he wants to tell us he found nothing in person, so we stop hoping. That's also possible, Ethan said. But Whitmore doesn't strike me as a man who sends telegrams about nothing. She looked at the 6 words again. Then she set the paper down and said, When can we leave? They left the next morning. Carl stayed to run the ranch. Tommy handled the livestock. Ethan told them both as little as possible, only that he had business in Billings that couldn't wait, and neither of them asked questions, which was one of the things Ethan most valued about both of them. The journey to Billings was 7 hours by rail. They sat across from each other, and for the first 2 hours there was work to do. Isabella had brought the ledger because she brought the ledger everywhere now, and Ethan had Whitmore's previous correspondence laid out between them. And then the work ran out, and there was just the train, and the motion, and the long open country outside, and the two of them sitting with 6 inches of space between them that had become its own complicated language. You're nervous, Ethan said. I'm not nervous, Isabella said without looking up from the window. You've been looking at that same mile of country for 20 minutes. She turned from the window. She looked at him. I'm afraid, she said with the precise honesty she always used when she decided something was worth saying clearly. I'm afraid Whitmore found something that's bad enough to change things. And I'm afraid he found nothing which doesn't change anything. She paused. Either way, I don't love this particular stretch of ours. No, Ethan agreed. Neither do I. She looked at him. You're afraid too. Of course I am. She was quiet for a moment. Then, as though the admission had released something, what are you most afraid of? He thought about it honestly. That we've done everything right and it won't be enough. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That one. The train moved through the country. Outside Montana went on forever in every direction, big and indifferent and beautiful, and inside the car. Ethan Cole and Isabella Marquez sat with their fears laid out plainly between them, like cards on a table, and the honesty of it was in its way, its own kind of comfort. Whitmore's office was on the 2nd floor of a solid building in the middle of Billings, and Charles Whitmore himself was a compact man in his late 50s, who had the particular energy of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the truth was contested and had developed a precise, controlled way of speaking that gave nothing away until he was ready to give it. He shook Ethan's hand. He shook Isabella's hand and held it a moment longer, looking at her with the focused attention of a man who was seeing her clearly for the first time and recalibrating accordingly. Mrs. Cole, he said, thank you for coming. What did you find? She said, because she had not traveled 7 hours to sit through a preamble. Whitmore looked at her for half a second, then decided he respected that, and sat down and got to it. He had found 2 things. The first, Joel Briggs, Tommy's cousin, had given a formal statement to a Laramie notary describing the exchange he'd witnessed at the freight yards. Vargas's representative handing money to 2 yardmen in exchange for information about northbound passenger movements, specifically the tracking of a woman matching Isabella's description. The statement named the representative described the exchange in detail and had been signed and sealed and was now sitting in Whitmore's file. That's solicitation of information through financial inducement across state lines, Whitmore said. It's not the most dramatic charge, but it's documentable, and it's real, and it establishes a pattern of conduct. Isabella leaned forward. You said 2 things. Whitmore opened another file. The second thing is more significant. He had, in the course of researching Vargas's background for the harassment case, contacted a colleague in San Antonio, a man who specialized in financial crimes. That colleague had made some inquiries of his own. And what came back was not just background. What came back was the information that Diego Vargas was already under investigation, had been for 14 months. A federal inquiry conducted quietly into a network of financial arrangements that moved money through legitimate businesses and out the other side in ways that were specifically and demonstrably illegal. He's not just a man with bad intentions, Whitmore said. He's a target. And the federal agents conducting the inquiry, he paused, choosing his words, have been looking for witnesses who had direct access to his operations. People who were inside the household, who saw the books, who understood how the money moved. The room was completely silent. Isabella sat very still. They've been looking for someone like me, she said. They've been looking for exactly you, Whitmore said. Ethan felt the weight of what had just shifted in the room. He looked at Isabella. Her face was doing something complicated, not fear this time. Something closer to the specific vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the thing they were running from and the thing that could save them are the same thing. If I talk to them, she said slowly. It would need to be arranged carefully, Whitmore said. And there are risks. Vargas has resources, and if he knows you've spoken, he already knows where I am, she said. He came to the ranch. Whitmore looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded once. Then the risk calculation changes, Whitmore said. He folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Cole, I want to be direct with you. If you cooperate with the federal inquiry, you gain two things. First, federal protection, which is considerably more than what I can provide. Second, Vargas's ability to pursue you through legal or financial channels gets eliminated because he becomes occupied with defending himself. He paused. But I won't pretend it's without cost. It requires you to speak to men you don't know about things you've spent a year trying to leave behind. And it requires trusting a system that hasn't always done well by women in your position. He let that sit. Isabella looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. He met her eyes and said nothing because he understood that this decision was not his to influence. He was there. That was all she'd asked of him, and it was all he was going to offer. Set the meeting, she said. They stayed in Billings 2 nights. The first night they sat in the hotel's small dining room and ate a quiet dinner and talked about nothing consequential. The ranch, the cattle numbers. What Carl was probably feeding the horses without supervision, and it was the specific kind of ordinary conversation that people have when they're standing next to something enormous and need something small and real to hold on to. You're certain about this, Ethan said. Not a question, an offering. I'm not certain about anything, she said. I'm decided. Those are different things. What's the difference? She looked at her hands on the table. Certain means you know it's right before you do it. Decided means you've chosen it anyway. She looked up. I've been running for a year. I've been afraid longer than that. I am so tired, Ethan. She said it simply without theater. I want it to be over. I want to stop looking at the North Road. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not romantic in any deliberate way, just present and deliberate and there. And she looked at his hand for a moment, and then she turned hers over beneath his and held it. They sat like that for a while. After this, he said, whatever comes, I want you to know. Don't, she said softly. Not yet. She looked at him. Say it after, when it's done. A pause. I want to hear it without anything hanging over it, he nodded, after he agreed. The second day. Whitmore arranged a meeting with a federal agent named Harrison, who was polite and contained, and who listened to everything Isabella said with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this information. She spoke for 2 hours. She was precise. She did not minimize what she'd seen or dress it up. She gave him dates and names and amounts and the specific structural details of how Vargas moved money through 3 separate business operations, 2 of which she had personally handled correspondence for without understanding at the time what she was handling. Ethan was not in the room for most of it. He sat outside in the hallway on a wooden chair and waited, and it was the longest hours he'd spent doing nothing in years. And when the door finally opened and she came out, she looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy, exhausted in the specific way of relief, not of defeat. It's done, she said. He stood. Are you all right? She thought about it. Ask me in a week, she said. Right now, I think I just need to go home. He registered the word home, and he said nothing about it, and they walked out of the building together into the Billings afternoon. They came back to a ranch that had not burned down, which Tommy reported with some pride. Carl only burned 2 biscuits, Tommy added, which is better than I expected, honestly. Life resumed. Or resumed in a new form, because everything was the same, and nothing quite was. Isabella moved through the house and the barn and the fields with the same focused efficiency, but there was something lighter in her. Not lighter, as in less substantial. Lighter, as in something that had been pressing from the inside had been released, and the space it left was not empty, but open. Ethan noticed. He was always noticing. He'd given up pretending otherwise, at least to himself. He had not said the thing he'd been going to say in Billings. She'd asked him to wait, and he was waiting, and the waiting was its own particular kind of alive. A thing vibrating between them that both of them could feel, and neither of them was pushing. The bank board's ruling came in on a Friday. Ethan was inside when Whitmore's telegram arrived. He read it at the kitchen table with Isabella standing 3 feet away, and he read it twice, and then he put it down and looked at her. The acceleration clause was struck, he said. She went very still. The foreclosure timeline is suspended. We have a standard repayment structure reinstated at the original terms. He looked at the telegram again, as though confirming it was real. Holt's report has been referred to the bank board's ethics committee. Isabella sat down. She sat down in the kitchen chair, not gracefully, not dramatically, just suddenly, like the legs had decided they'd been holding things up long enough. It worked, she said. It worked. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. He watched her take 3 very controlled breaths in a row, and then she looked up, and her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen before, and she said, "We need to write to Whitmore." "In a minute," he said. "The supplier accounts we should—" "In a minute, Isabella." She stopped. He sat down across from her. He looked at her directly. "We won," he said. "Let that be true for 1 minute before we go back to work." She looked at him. The brightness in her eyes did something complicated. She pressed her lips together briefly. Then she said, 1 minute. 1 minute, he agreed. They sat in the quiet kitchen with the telegram on the table between them, and outside the window. The ranch was alive and intact, and theirs, and for 60 seconds, neither of them moved or planned or calculated anything at all. Then she reached for a piece of paper. He was already smiling when she started writing. The celebration, such as it was, happened that evening. Tommy brought 2 bottles of something that he claimed a friend had made, and which no one examined too closely. Carl produced a cake that was more ambition than execution, but was eaten enthusiastically. Mrs. Hendricks arrived uninvited with preserves and the specific warm authority of a woman who has decided a gathering is happening and has taken charge of making it happen correctly. It was not a large party, it was the right size. Ethan stood by the porch door and watched Isabella in the middle of it. Tommy making her laugh, that real, startled laugh that was gone before you could get enough of it. Carl explaining the cake's structural difficulties with tremendous sincerity. Mrs. Hendricks holding her hand and saying something quiet that made Isabella look at the floor for a moment, with the expression of someone receiving something they didn't quite know how to hold. How was watching her? The way he'd been watching her for weeks, openly, unguardedly. The way a man looks at something he has stopped pretending not to value. Mrs. Hendricks appeared beside him. "She's remarkable," she said without preamble. "Yes," Ethan said, not guarded, just true. "You know that, I hope." "I'm becoming aware of it." Mrs. Hendricks looked at him with the particular look of a woman who has been watching people for 60 years and finds most of them predictable. "Don't wait too long," she said. "Men your age think waiting is noble. Mostly it's just slow." She went back inside. Ethan looked at the sky for a moment. Then he went back in too. It was past 10 when the last person left and the house was quiet again. Isabella was washing the last of the cups. Ethan was at the table with the lantern low, not doing anything in particular, which was unusual enough for both of them that she noticed it. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Thinking," he said. "About what?" About what I was going to say in Billings. The water sounds stopped. She stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she dried her hands on the cloth by the basin, and she turned around and she leaned back against the counter and looked at him with the careful, open expression she'd developed over the past weeks. The one that was not guarded exactly, but was honest about the fact that honesty cost something. "Say it," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen. "I didn't write to that agency because I needed help with the ranch," he said. "I mean, I did. But that's not the real reason." He held her gaze. "I wrote because I was drowning in a house that used to mean something, and I didn't know how to make it mean something again alone." He paused. "And then you arrived, and in about 3 weeks you made it mean something again, without me even noticing it was happening." Isabella was very still. "I know what this started as," he said. "An arrangement. Practical. I know you didn't come here to stay. And I know you've had people in your life treat you like something to be owned, and I would rather cut off my hand than be another one of them." He stopped, breathed. "So I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just telling you that you are the most real thing that has happened to me in 2 years. And whatever you decide about what comes next, I need you to know that." The kitchen was completely quiet. Isabella looked at him for a long time. Then she pushed off the counter and crossed the kitchen, and she stopped in front of him close, and she put her hand against the side of his face, her palm warm against his jaw, and she said, "Do you remember what you said to me the night I told you about Vargas? That you were glad I was there, whatever came with it?" "Yes," he said. "I didn't know what to do with that," she said. "No one had ever—" She stopped, steadied. "I've spent my whole life being something people wanted to have, not someone they were glad of." She looked at him. Her eyes were very clear. "I didn't come here to stay. You're right about that. But I stayed. And I stayed because for the first time I understood what it felt like to be seen instead of owned." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I've never done this. Actually done it without it being survival or obligation or someone else's decision." She looked at him. "But I know that when I think about leaving, something in me refuses. And I've learned to pay attention to the things that refuse." Ethan's hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his jaw. "Then stay," he said. "I'm already staying," she said. And then before either of them could say another word, the front door opened. Not knocked. Opened. And Diego Vargas walked into the house. He was not alone. There was a man behind him, large, quiet, with the specific presence of someone whose function was to stand in a doorway and make it feel smaller. Vargas looked at the room, at the remains of the evening, at the low lantern, at Ethan and Isabella standing together in the kitchen with their hands touching, and he smiled the smile that Ethan had only seen once before, through a gate in the long evening light. "Isabella," he said. His voice was warm. It was the warmth of a man who had decided on the correct temperature in advance and deployed it deliberately. "I've been looking for you." Isabella's hand dropped from Ethan's face. She stepped back, not away from Ethan. She stayed beside him, actually moved slightly closer, but she put space between herself and Vargas, and she looked at him with an expression that was not the fear he expected, and not the defiance he probably also expected. It was something colder than either. "I know you have," she said. "I was worried about you." He looked around the kitchen. "This is not what I imagined for you." "What you imagined for me," Isabella said, "is not something I've considered in quite some time." Vargas's smile held. He looked at Ethan. "And you must be the husband." He said the word with the faintest edge. "She's quite extraordinary, isn't she? I can understand the appeal." Ethan looked at him. He was very calm in the way he'd been calm with Pharaoh in The Feed Merchant, the calm of someone who has already decided where they stand and is not interested in moving. "You're in my house," Ethan said, "without invitation. The door wasn't locked." "It is now," Ethan said, and he didn't look away from Vargas, and his voice didn't rise, and the man in the doorway shifted his weight slightly and then held still. Vargas looked between them. Something in his calculation was adjusting, not obviously, not dramatically, but Isabella could see it. She had spent years reading this man, and she could see the hairline adjustment behind the warm expression. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected to find her alone, or close enough to alone, that the difference didn't matter. He hadn't expected Ethan specifically hadn't expected this particular kind of stillness, this specific brand of immovable. Isabella, Vargas said. Come home. Whatever this is, whatever he's told you it can be. Diego. Her voice was very level. I have spoken to federal agents. I have given them 2 hours of detailed testimony about your financial operations. Specific accounts, specific transactions, specific dates. She watched his face. They've been investigating you for over a year. They were waiting for someone who had been inside. She paused. They found me. The warmth left Vargas's face. Not slowly, all at once. What replaced it was not anger and not panic. It was something colder and more calculating, the authentic face under the performance, and it was worse than the smile had been. You don't know what you've done, he said. I know exactly what I've done, she said. Ethan moved, not toward Vargas. To the desk beside the kitchen door, where because Isabella had insisted weeks ago when they'd started planning, because Isabella thought about exits and contingencies and the things that most people hoped wouldn't be necessary. There was a document, a copy of the federal filing, Harrison's contact information, and a letter from Whitmore that described precisely and legally the consequences of any intimidation or interference with a protected witness. He picked it up and crossed the room and held it out. Vargas looked at it, did not take it. You'll want to read that, Ethan said, or have your lawyers read it. Either way. He kept his hand extended steady, holding the papers with the patience of a man who was entirely willing to stand there all night. And then I think you should leave. The man in the doorway looked at Vargas. Vargas looked at Isabella one more time. His face was doing something complicated and controlled, and she held his gaze without flinching, and she did not move from Ethan's side. Vargas took the papers. He looked at the first page. He folded them. He put them inside his coat. He looked at Isabella one last time with an expression that said without words, precisely, this is not finished. She met it without moving. He turned and walked out. The man in the doorway followed. The front door closed. The house was silent. Isabella let out a breath that she had been holding for so long, it might have been years. Ethan turned to her. Are you? Yes, she said. Her voice was very steady. Call Whitmore, tonight. He needs to know Vargas made direct contact. Isabella. Ethan, we need to... In a minute, he said, which was what she'd said to him after the bank ruling, and she heard it and stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. You didn't move, he said. When he walked in, you didn't step back. She thought about it. No, she said slowly. I didn't. That's different from a year ago. Yes, she said, and something in her voice had the texture of a discovery being made in real time. I think it is. They stood in the quiet kitchen, and outside the ranch was dark and still, and somewhere down the road a man who had spent years defining what Isabella Marquez was worth was riding away with a federal document in his pocket, and the beginning of an understanding that the ground had permanently shifted. Ethan picked up the pen. Let's write to Whitmore, he said. She sat beside him, and they wrote. Whitmore's response came before sunrise. Not a telegram, this time. A hand-delivered letter carried by a rider. Whitmore had apparently sent the moment he'd received their message, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about how seriously Whitmore was taking Vargas's appearance at the ranch. The letter was 3 pages. Ethan read it aloud at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, with Isabella across from him, and 2 cups of coffee between them that neither of them had touched. The core of it was this: Vargas's direct contact with Isabella constituted witness intimidation. Harrison's team had been informed within the hour. A federal marshal would reach Millhaven within 48 hours. In the meantime, Whitmore had filed an emergency protective order through the Billings court, which meant that Vargas's ability to approach Isabella, or anyone associated with her, was now a matter of federal record and federal consequence. Whitmore's last paragraph was short. He made a mistake coming to the ranch. Men like Vargas understand power. What he encountered there did not look like what he expected. That will unsettle him. Unsettled men make errors. Be ready. Ethan put the letter down. Isabella had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she was looking at the table, and he could see her processing it, the way she always processed things thoroughly and without theater, working through the implications in sequence before she allowed herself a reaction. "He's going to run," she said. "You think so? He came here to retrieve me or frighten me into silence. He got neither, and now he knows I've already talked." She looked up. Men like Diego don't stand and fight when the odds shift. They move, they reorganize, they find a new angle. And if he runs before the marshal arrives, then it becomes Harrison's problem, not ours. She said it steadily, but he could hear the effort underneath the steadiness, the particular discipline of someone who has spent years calculating exits for other people, and is now for the first time trying to trust that someone else is calculating for her. "Isabella," he said. She looked at him. "It's almost over." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "That's what frightens me, actually." He tilted his head slightly. "I've been living inside the fight for so long," she said slowly, "that I'm not entirely certain I remember how to live outside it." She looked at the letter. "What does a person do when the thing they've been bracing against stops coming?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I can tell you what I did. When Margaret died and the grief stopped being sharp and started being just ambient, everywhere, part of the air." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I didn't know what to do with the quiet either. I filled it with work. And then the work started failing too, and there was nothing left to fill it with, and I just sat in it." He looked at her. "Until you arrived and gave me something to build toward instead of just endure." She looked at him for a long time. "We're quite a pair," she said quietly. "We are," he agreed. "Two people who forgot how to live and then accidentally taught each other." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than a smile. "Accidentally," she repeated. "Mostly," he said. And that one landed, and she did smile fully briefly and looked away, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was going cold, and outside the ranch was just beginning to wake up, and for that particular moment, everything was exactly enough. The federal marshal arrived in 36 hours, not 48. His name was Connors, and he was a tall, weathered man of about 50, who shook hands firmly and spoke in short, informative sentences, and had the quality of someone who had seen enough of the world's worst behavior that very little of it surprised him anymore. He sat at Ethan's kitchen table, which had hosted in the past several months a debt collector, a land attorney, and a man who wanted to reclaim a woman who had left him, and which was becoming something of a significant piece of furniture, and he talked to Isabella for an hour. She told him what she'd told Harrison, and then she told him about Vargas's visit to the ranch, and she described the man who'd been with him, and she gave Connors the specific language Vargas had used, and the specific expression on his face when she'd told him about the federal testimony. Connors listened. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a stub pencil. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. "He'll have moved by now," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Isabella said. "Probably south. That's his pattern. He goes back to familiar territory when a situation goes wrong." He looked up. "Harrison's team has been coordinating with authorities in Texas for the past 3 weeks. We expected this eventually. Your testimony accelerated it, but the infrastructure was there." He paused. "What you did took courage, Mrs. Cole. I want you to know that it mattered." Isabella received this without deflecting it, which Ethan noticed it was new. That ability to simply accept something offered without immediately converting it into a transaction or a deflection. She was learning, or remembering. He wasn't entirely sure which. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait for the arrest," Connors said. "Could be days, could be a few weeks. When it happens, you may be asked to provide additional testimony. Written most likely. Possibly in person, but we'll make that as contained as possible." He closed his notebook. "In the meantime, the protective order is active. You're covered legally. If he or anyone connected to him makes contact, you call the billings office directly." He slid a card across the table. "Day or night." Isabella picked up the card. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and it was such a small thing, a piece of cardstock with a name and a number. But the way she held it made Ethan understand that it was the first time in a very long time that she'd had something like official protection, and the weight of having it was not nothing. "Thank you," she said. Connors stood. He shook their hands again. He left. The house was quiet. Tommy appeared in the doorway from the hall. He'd been doing something very focused in the back room for the past hour and had clearly heard all of it. "So," he said. "Is it done?" "Almost," Ethan said. Tommy nodded slowly. "Good," he said. And then, because Tommy Briggs had never once in his life followed a significant moment with silence, when he could follow it with practical action. "Carl made breakfast. You should eat something." Douglas Farrow's reckoning came 3 days later, and it came not with drama, but with paperwork, which was somehow more satisfying. Whitmore's investigation into the bank's conduct. The report Holt had filed the communication with Farrow, the pattern across multiple ranch foreclosures, had been submitted to the State Banking Commission the previous week. What came back was a formal inquiry notice delivered to the First Federal Bank of Billings, and simultaneously a separate letter to Farrow himself regarding his documented communication with bank officials in matters where he held a financial interest. Ethan received a copy of both courtesy of Whitmore on a Thursday morning. He read them at the kitchen table. He passed them to Isabella. She read them. She set them down. She looked at the wall for a moment. "Farrow didn't expect anyone to connect the pattern," she said. "No. He's been doing it for years. He assumed it would continue because it always had. People like that usually do." She turned the pages over face down, which was its own kind of statement. "Will it be enough? The inquiry. Whitmore thinks the commission will refer it to the state attorney. He says the pattern across multiple properties is hard to argue around." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Farrow's lawyers will make it slow, but it started." "The other ranchers," Isabella said. "The ones who lost land to him. The Walkers, the Prentice family. Whitmore's looking into whether there's a recourse claim." Ethan looked at her. "It was your idea. You told him to look." She shook her head slightly. "It shouldn't require an idea. It should just be what happens." "It should," he agreed. "It doesn't always. You made it happen." She was quiet for a moment. Then she put her hand flat on the table, a gesture he'd come to recognize, the palm-down grounding gesture she used when she was deciding how much of something to let show. "When I came here," she said, "I was trying to disappear. Just get small enough that no one would notice me. Manage my corner of things and stay out of everything else." She looked at him. "I didn't expect to care about Millhaven. I didn't expect to care about the Walkers, or the Prentice family, or Mrs. Hendricks, or any of it." A pause. "I didn't expect to care about you." Ethan said nothing. He let it sit. "That's not a complaint," she said quickly. "I know," he said. "I'm just—" She stopped. Tried again. "I'm telling you that the person who stepped off that wagon 3 months ago was trying to get small. And somewhere in the middle of all of this." She gestured vaguely at the table, at the papers, at the kitchen and the ranch and all of it. "I stopped trying to be small." "No," Ethan said. "You didn't. You just stopped having to be." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "You were never small, Isabella. You were just in places that needed you to be." The kitchen was absolutely still. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she stood up and picked up the papers and said, "I'm going to write to Whitmore about the Prentice claim." And her voice was entirely level, and her eyes were very bright, and she went to the desk and sat down and started writing, and Ethan sat at the table and watched her, and felt something in his chest that was large and warm, and entirely without apology. The arrest came on a Wednesday, 16 days after Connors had sat at their table. It came in the form of a telegram from Harrison's office, 4 lines factual final. Vargas had been apprehended in San Antonio, attempting to board a ship with a passport issued under a different name. 3 associates had been taken simultaneously. The charges were federal multiple, and according to Harrison's carefully measured language, substantial. Ethan read the telegram aloud. Isabella was standing at the window when he started reading. By the time he finished, she had sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. Just her legs had apparently decided they were done, and she sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and her face in her hands, and she stayed there for a long moment. Ethan came and sat on the floor beside her. I didn't say anything. He just sat beside her shoulder to shoulder on the kitchen floor of his ranch in Montana, and he let her be in it. After a while, she lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't crying, or she was past it, or she was somewhere beside it, in the territory that exists when something you've been bracing against for so long finally stops, and the body doesn't know what to do with the absence of the weight. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She turned her head and looked at him. She was very close, sitting on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, the kind of proximity that only happens when you've stopped managing distance. "Say it now," she said. He looked at her. "What you were going to say in Billings," she said. "What you said part of in the kitchen the night Vargas came." Her voice was quiet and direct. "Say the rest of it." Ethan looked at her for a moment. At her face, which he had memorized without intending to, which he knew in its every configuration. Now the focus and the composure and the rare startled laugh and the way it looked right now, stripped of everything she used to manage the world, just honest and open and waiting. "I love you," he said, simply, without preamble. She didn't move. "Not because you saved the ranch," he said. "Not because you're capable, or because you know how to read a bank document, or because you handled every impossible thing that came at us this winter." He held her gaze. "Because you're real. Because you say true things even when they cost you. Because you stayed on this floor instead of running, and I know what running would have been easier, and you chose not to." He stopped. "I love you because of who you are when no one's requiring anything of you." Isabella looked at him for a long time. Her eyes did the thing that they'd been doing since almost the beginning. The thing he'd watched 100 times, the slow movement from distance toward warmth. But this time, it didn't stop where it usually stopped. This time, it went all the way. "I've never been loved like that," she said. Just plainly, without it being about what I could do, or what I looked like, or what someone wanted me to be. She breathed. "I don't entirely know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's just true." She looked at him another moment. Then she leaned forward, and she kissed him, not tentative, not strategic, not the performance of something. Just her Isabella choosing this freely for the first time in her life, choosing something purely because she wanted to. When she pulled back, she looked at him with the expression of someone who has just done something irrevocable and is not sorry about it. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They sat on the kitchen floor for another few minutes, side by side, and outside the ranch was loud with morning and life, and the sounds of Carl and Tommy doing something that involved a great deal of disagreement about the correct method, and eventually Isabella said, "We should probably get up," and Ethan said, "Probably," and neither of them moved for another minute, and then they did. Spring came to the Cole Ranch, the way it comes to Montana, not gently, not gradually, but decisively, like a door opening. The land that had spent the winter locked and gray and enduring suddenly had opinions. The cattle were restless with good health. The chicken count had reached 16. The fence lines held. The supplier accounts were current. The grain stores were adequate, and then more than adequate. Whitmore sent a formal letter in March, confirming that the bank's acceleration clause had been permanently invalidated, that Holt had resigned under pressure from the Ethics Committee, and that the state attorney had opened a formal investigation into Farrow's land acquisition practices. 2 families, the Prentices and a family named Gerber, that Ethan hadn't mentioned, but Isabella had found in the county records, had been connected with a land reclamation attorney. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before either of them moved it. People from town came and went more now. The ranch had become something different in Millhaven, not a cautionary story about a broken widower barely holding on, but something more complicated and more interesting. The kind of place where things happened, and people who showed up found themselves caught up in the momentum of it. Mrs. Hendricks came weekly. Carl had become permanent staff and brought his younger brother on for the spring work. Tommy had started teaching a neighbor's son about livestock management on Saturday mornings. Isabella noticed all of it. She tracked it with the same attention she tracked everything. Not sentimentally, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition that something had changed in the structure of the place, and the change was real, and it mattered. One afternoon in late March, she was helping Carl repair the south fence, and she stopped and looked at the land. Really looked at it, the way she'd looked at it that very first day. The practical exit mapping assessment of a woman calculating the dimensions of a situation, and what she felt was the complete opposite of what she'd felt then. She wasn't calculating exits. She was recognizing home. It hit her so suddenly and so cleanly that she stood still for a moment with a fence post in her hands while Carl looked at her sideways with the particular patience of a man accustomed to waiting for people to work things out. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And it was the truest version of those two words she'd spoken in years. It was Ethan who found her that evening sitting on the porch steps with the ranch quiet around her and the sky going wide and pink in every direction. He sat down beside her, shoulder to shoulder the way they'd taken to sitting, not because there wasn't space, but because the proximity had stopped requiring justification and had simply become the natural configuration. "Carl said you stopped working and stared at the fence for 2 minutes," he said. "Carl exaggerates. He said it was closer to 3. She smiled. "I had a moment. A good one or a bad one?" She thought about it. "The kind where you realize something that was already true." She looked at the land. "I've been thinking about the day I arrived. I stood in this yard, and I assessed it where the fence was failing, where the water trough was leaking, how far behind everything was." "I remember," he said. "You told me you wanted to see the barn before the house. I was calculating what I'd gotten myself into." She paused. "I do that when I'm afraid. I inventory. I find the problems and I map them because it gives me something to do with the fear that isn't just feeling it. And today I looked at the land and I didn't calculate anything." She turned to look at him. "I just knew it. The way you know a thing that belongs to you. Not as a possession, as a place that has your shape in it." She looked back at the ranch. "I didn't know I was looking for that. I didn't know that was something I was allowed to find." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know what I remember about the day you arrived," he said. "What? I thought you'd be gone in 2 weeks." He paused. "I was so certain you'd leave that I didn't let myself look at you directly for the first 3 days. I thought if I didn't invest too much attention, it wouldn't cost as much when you went." She looked at him. "Ethan." "I know," he said. "I was wrong." "You were catastrophically wrong," she said, and the warmth in her voice made it entirely clear that this was not a criticism. He took her hand. Not dramatically, just his hand finding hers in the space between them, the way it had been doing for weeks now, natural and certain, and without requiring any particular decision. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The arrangement we made," he said, "when you arrived, the legal and practical and no promises version of this." He paused. "I'd like to renegotiate it." She looked at him. Something in her face did the slow, private movement toward warmth that he loved, that he'd been watching since almost the beginning, that still arrived with the force of something new every single time. "What terms are you proposing?" she said. "No arrangement," he said. "No structure, no contract." He looked at her directly. "Just this. Just us. Permanent." She was quiet. "I know you didn't come here to stay," he said. "You've said that. I know what it cost you to stay. I know you're still learning what staying feels like without it being obligation." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to decide because of what you owe me or the ranch or any of it. I'm asking because it's what I want, and I think it's what you want too, and I think we've both spent enough of our lives doing things because we had to, instead of because we chose to." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. The light was going gold over the ranch. Somewhere in the yard, Carl and Tommy were having their daily disagreement about something entirely inconsequential. The cattle were settling, the chickens were in, the fence lines held. "I didn't come here to stay," she said. He waited. "But I'm staying," she said. "Not because I have to, not because it's safe, not because I have nowhere else to go." She looked at him with the full, clear, unguarded honesty that she'd been learning to offer and he'd been learning to receive. Because this is where I want to be. Because you're who I want to be beside. Because for the first time in my life, the place I'm standing and the life I'm living are the same thing. She laced her fingers through his. So yes, she said. Renegotiate the terms. I accept. He looked at her for a moment that was quiet and full and entirely sufficient. Then he said, good. And she said, good. And they sat on the porch steps of the Cole Ranch in the long Montana evening, with their hands joined, and the land alive around them, and the particular piece of people who have fought hard for something, and found it worth every inch of the fight. The months that followed were not perfect. There were hard weeks when the money was tight again, and the tension of it lived in the house like weather. There was a hearing in Billings in May that required Isabella to give testimony one more time in a formal room with formal men about things she'd worked hard to leave behind, and she came home from that and didn't talk for an evening, and Ethan made dinner and left her alone with it, and that was the right thing, and she told him so the next morning. There was a letter from the Prentice family in June, thanking them for the role Whitmore's filing had played in opening their reclamation case, and Isabella read it 3 times before she folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer where she kept the things that mattered. There were ordinary days, long ones, physical ones days, that asked everything from both of them, and paid back in the specific satisfaction of work done well on land that was theirs. And there were the evenings, the kitchen table with the lamp low, the porch in the long light, the quiet of 2 people who had learned to be in the same space without filling it unnecessarily, who had learned each other's silences as well as their words, who had built without planning to build it, without a blueprint, out of desperation and practicality, and something neither of them had been looking for, a life that was genuinely, irreversibly their own. By fall, the ranch had become something it had not been in years full. Not wealthy, not without its difficulties, but full of work and people and the specific hum of a place that is being cared for and that returns the care. 3 permanent hands. A supply arrangement with 2 neighboring properties that benefited everyone involved. A name in Mill Haven that meant something different than it had meant when the year began. And on a quiet October evening, Ethan came in from the North Field and found Isabella at the kitchen table not working, just sitting with a cup of tea and the lamp turned low, and she looked up when he came in with the open, easy expression that had become her natural face in this house. The one he'd watched emerge slowly from underneath all the discipline and the distance, and he thought not for the first time, but with the same force every time, that he had no idea how to account for the fact that she was here. He sat down across from her. I thought I lost everything when Margaret died, he said. She looked at him. I told myself the ranch was the thing I was holding on to, the promise I'd made. He held her gaze. But I think I was holding on to the wrong thing. I think I was holding on to grief because I didn't believe I was allowed anything else. He paused. And then you arrived and made me believe something else was possible. Not instead of everything I lost. In addition to it. She set her cup down. She looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was, he had learned, one of the most significant things she gave. I came here to survive, she said. That was the entire plan. Survive and disappear and be small enough that the world forgot to come looking. She held his gaze. And instead I found out that I was allowed to take up space. That I was allowed to matter. That someone could look at all of me, the difficult parts, the frightened parts, the parts that made men want to own me and choose me anyway. Her voice was steady and certain. You did that. This place did that. I am not the same person who stepped off that wagon. No, he said. Neither am I. She reached across the table. He took her hand. Outside the window, the Cole Ranch settled into the evening alive, intact, and belonging to 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate losses and built something neither of them had known they needed until they were already inside it. They had not come to each other easily. They had not come to each other cleanly. They had come through debt and grief and fear, and men who wanted to take what wasn't theirs through long nights over ledgers and harder nights over harder truths, through the specific courage required to stay when every old instinct said to run, but they had stayed. And what they had built from the staying imperfect, hard-won, entirely real, was not a story about rescue or beauty, or two lonely people filling each other's empty spaces. It was a story about two people who chose clearly and deliberately, and without illusion, to be home to each other. And that choice made freely, made daily, made in full knowledge of everything it cost, and everything it gave, that was the thing that held. That was the thing that lasted. That was enough.